I initially went to college at the University of Houston, and thought that college was about making money, so I majored in finance. And actually did pretty well in finance, but I'm not good with mathematics, so had trouble with accounting and a few other things. And anyway, circumstances intervened, and finance was not my forte. And in 1966, I changed schools and majors, went to Stephen F. Austin, majored in history, and did pretty well. And got into graduate school in '68, one semester, and I got drafted. Apparently, the powers that be were more interested in me making history than studying it. So I went to Vietnam and came back radicalized by the experience, and tried to pick up where I left off but couldn't sit the classes, and was hanging sheetrock and framing and got a little tired of that and decided to do an underground comic book because I did have some artistic talent. Went to see Jim Franklin about that. Tom Sawyered me into doing a poster he didn't want to do, and that was a first poster I did for Armadillo World Headquarters, and then I ended up doing 20-something more. And then moved into the broader realm of Austin music art after that. I did a lot of posters, as did my colleagues, Michael Priest, Jim Franklin, Guy Juke, Bill Narum, Sam Yates, Gary McElhaney, Henry Gonzalez, and a number of others. Collectively, we were sort of known by as the Armadillo Art Squad. Anyway, the posters were significant. Actually, the posters were sort of vital to the early Austin music scene in the early '70s because it was the primary way of promoting and advertising the shows. None of these venues had any money. Even the biggest one, the Armadillo, didn't have any money. So posters were a way to promote and put butts in seats, and without having to spend a lot of money. They couldn't even afford newspaper ads, much less radio spots or anything exotic like a television spot or anything like that was out of the question. But because the countercultural community was concentrated around the university and south of the river, it was therefore possible to saturate the areas of these communities with these posters. And the poster was already had a good name because of the San Francisco type that came out in the mid-'60s to late '60s. And in point of fact, there was a significant Austin-San Francisco connection back then. Not only with the music, like with Janis Joplin or God, what is his name? Chet Flippo? No, Chet Helms. Chet Helms. Not only with the music, like I said, with Janis Joplin, Chet Helms, Johnny Winter, 13th Floor Elevators, and some other people, but also the art. Jack Jackson and Gilbert Sheldon were doing art here for the Vulcan Gas Company in the late '60s. And then they went out to San Francisco, where they continued to do art for the Fillmore and the Avalon, and then individual bands like the Grateful Dead and so forth and so on. And they established Rip-Off Press, which not only produced movie posters, but also produced underground comics and underground literature of all sorts. This was a direct Austin to San Francisco connection. But anyway, back to the posters. Because of the San Francisco type and their collectability, doing posters for a incipient music scene was really the smart thing to do, and it was economical. Typically, we were restricted to one or two colors. Now, one color, when you're talking about printed images, one color is generally black. I mean, your process color is CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. And black has, if you're doing a one color poster, it almost always has to be black. We could also use a spot color. So the typical Austin music poster for the first half of the 1970s was 11 by 17, offset printed, two color black with a spot color. And this was back in the sharp stick and a rock technology days. So they were done with mechanical overlays. And it was quite a little process to produce these. But like I said, in the first half of the 70s, it was 11 by 17, offset printed, two color posters. And then in the latter part of the 70s, then we started getting into full color, which is when you're talking about process color, which is the only way it could be done back then. That was a four color piece. And it was usually, even though we could do four colors, we typically did manual separations for those. Only rarely could somebody afford a process separated full color poster that was taken from a continuous tone image, such as a painting or a colored drawing. Back then, because the technology was very analog and not digital, just to separate the colors cost around $300. Just what you get as a function of Photoshop today, where you can go in there and have it CMYK or RGB, which are the primary colors of light. It's done automatically. If you go into Photoshop or another graphics program, it's done automatically by the program. Back then, you had to scan it on a drum, and it cost about $300 to separate the colors. Cyan, which is blue, magenta, which is red. Actually, cyan is blue to the purple, magenta is red to the purple, and yellow and black. So that is today still a full color process printed piece. But back then, the cost was prohibitively expensive. Now, when Willie started doing the picnics, he could afford that. And so some of the first full color processed posters that I did were for Willie Nelson. I didn't do the first picnic, Jim Franklin did. He was almost always there first, but I did the second one. And I did the fourth one, and I did the fifth one, and the sixth one, and the seventh one, and a few more after that. Austin music artists did have we do have, and did back in the 70s when it started, did have a very tight little community. I depended on them a lot because, like I said, I'd been a history major and I hadn't really taken any art courses. So it was my colleagues that really taught me art. And those colleagues essentially were Jim Franklin, Michael Priest, Guy Juke, Bill Narum, Henry Gonzalez, Sam Yates, Gary McElhaney, and a few others. We had a studio that Michael Priest founded called Show Nuff Studios. Show Nuff being a very positive Southern phrase indicating that I will do that, or it will be done. Show enough, sure enough, show enough. And it was spelled S-H-E-A-U-X-N-O-U-G-H. And anyway, we produced the bulk of the music posters for the 70s and the early part of the 80s there. Michael Priest founded the studio, and Guy Juke, also known as D. White, and I sort of formed the cohort of the studio, with other artists joining us later, coming and going. The Austin Chronicle, when it first started up, was in our midst because we had a copy camera and they needed one. And once again, sharp stick and a rock technology as far as imaging goes. We were, you know, about a half a dozen or more artists as fish in a very small pond. And there weren't that many jobs around initially, but we managed to take jobs without stepping on each other's toes too much. So we remained friends, colleagues more than competitors. And that kind of defined the Austin music artists back in the day, before a lot of other people joined us. And we're still friends to this day. Unfortunately, about half of us have passed on. Ken Featherston, Jack Jackson, Bill Narum, Henry Gonzalez, and lately here, Michael Priest. And I have to say something about Michael. Michael was one of the titans of the Austin music artists. Jim Franklin was the titan. He's done more, done it in the most different ways, and done it for the longest period of time. So he started out in the 60s, and of course Jim was the one that came up with the concept of the Armadillo as a Texas icon and an institution. And just as the longhorn is probably the animal for the state, I would say, or the culture of the state, I would say the armadillo is probably the animal for the counterculture of the state. And this, of course, was incarnated into Armadillo World Headquarters, which was, I consider to be the cornerstone for the entire Austin music edifice. It really kicked things off. Now, there's a lot of other venues that deserve to be mentioned: Soap Creek, Castle Creek, the Opry Houses, Texas, Austin, and of course, you know, individuals like Willie Nelson and Stevie Ray Vaughan. But what really started it off was the Armadillo, and which is why you hear so much about it today when people do talk about Austin music. And all these artists that I mentioned produced music art for the Armadillo. And I did not work for the Armadillo World Headquarters directly. Most of these guys did, and they were part of the Armadillo. I just freelanced and got commissions from the Armadillo, but most of these guys worked for the Armadillo, which meant they wore more than the artist's beret. They wore the bouncer's hat, they wore the bartender's hat, they wore the construction crew's hat. They just did whatever needed to be done. And unfortunately, in 1976, while Ken Featherston was serving as a bouncer, somebody got ejected from the club and by another bouncer. This was prior to the 21st century, when everybody had a gun handy. He had to actually drive across town to get a gun and come back, and nurturing his anger and hatred that whole time. But he came back and he shot at one of the bouncers, but he was a pretty poor shot, and he hit Ken and killed him. And that was a real tragedy, because at that time Ken Featherston was probably the best of all of us, and I certainly considered him the best, and he taught me so much. Some of my favorite pieces, let's see, from the Armadillo days, I guess my all-time favorite Armadillo poster is the Lost Gonzo Band, Benefit of a Doubt. And I really liked the Los Gonzo Band. I thought they were one of the best bands to come out of Austin in those glory days, and didn't get the recognition they deserved. And they had come out with their first album called The Lost Gonzo Band, I believe. And it featured a tornado with a white horse on the front. White horse rearing up, tornado behind him. So I riffed off that and produced a scene where a tornado was in the background, and in the foreground were 4 horses, white horses, as they were on the album cover, running at you, according to the POV. And each one of those horses represented one of the band members. The one up front with the rose in its mouth, kind of leading the band, was Bob Livingston. The one right behind him and off to the right was John Inman. And the one behind John, in the far background, was Paul Piercy, the drummer, who is always in the far background. And off to the side was a horse kind of running away from the direction of the other 3, and that was Gary P. Nunn. And anyway, that's my favorite poster that I did for the Armadillo. And what I tried to do in that poster and in several others is kind of set up a narrative of something going on, something that is pertinent to the subject matter, in this case, the Los Gonzo Band. I'm trying to think of another one that I did. After Ken Featherston was shot and killed, I did a poster for the Marshall Tucker Band, and Ken had just done an album cover for the Marshall Tucker Band, which was a guy riding a bucking bronco over a crescent moon. And I eliminated the moon, but had the guy riding the bronco, and dedicated the poster to Ken. That's another favorite of mine. The posters and the artwork for which I'm most known are probably the Antone series that I did. Antone's opened up on 6th Street, 6th and Brazos, in 1975, in July of 1975. I believe the 17th was when they opened the doors. And I just went down there and talked to Clifford Antone and asked him if he needed any artwork, and he said the first thing he needed was a logo. And so in 1975, I did a logo for Antone's, which they still use today. It was a picture of Little Walter, the legendary harpist, and with the Antone's lettering that the family used, which Clifford insisted be on there. And then I did a little filigree. I was into like 19th century motifs, and so it was sort of what is generally referred to as a scripophily, which is financial imaging, such as you see on currency or stocks and bonds. I was into that, so I bracketed the image of Little Walter with 2 bits of scripophily, and then underneath I said Austin's Home of the Blues, which Clifford also insisted going there. Clifford was really great to work for, but he had 2 or 3 things he insisted upon. The first and foremost was that I treat the subject matter of the blues artists with respect. There was to be no caricatures, there were to be no cartoons, there was nothing to be frivolous. It was just, he wanted me to treat them with respect, so I did. And in that regard, some of the best ones I produced were the ones I did for Muddy Waters and John Lee Hooker, Maceo Parker, Albert Collins, Albert King, Angela Straley, geez, so many. Sort of lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Anyway, of course, I did about 3 or 4 of Stevie Ray Vaughan. And the real magic of Antone's, especially when it started up in 1975 on 6th Street, was the fact that Clifford would book the old blues legends who were having, in the early 70s, were having, or the mid 70s, were having a difficult time getting booking. And he would bring them down here and put them up for a week to play. And while they were here, they got to play with the local blues musicians, such as Stevie Ray Vaughan, his brother Jimmy, Denny Freeman, Derek O'Brien, George Raines, Charlie Sexton, Doyle Bramall 1, Doyle Bramall 2. All of these guys who were young kids then and who had worshiped these old blues legends actually got to play with them on the stage. And that's where the real magic of Antone's came down. And really the magic of music in this town, because you were able to partner living legends with up-and-coming legends of their own who just weren't there yet. And a tremendous relationship was sparked specifically between Stevie Ray Vaughan and Albert King. And if you, PBS will put on a video of them playing together every fund drive, and here in Austin, and you can see that. But there was real magic between them. And the first time they played together, you could see that Albert King was really taken aback by just the sheer power and prowess of Stevie's music. And that was something really special. And it was really incarnated in the first club, but it carried on to the other 4 locations. There have been actually 5 locations that Antone's has, and Antone's now remains the longest man standing in Austin, the longest continuous venue, and I'm very proud to have been associated with it.